This is White Centipede Noise Podcast. I'm Oscar Brummel, and today my guest is Max Eastman of Tribe Tapes, a label started in 2019 with a focus on reissuing obscure cassette culture releases from the 80s and 90s, as well as releasing work from modern artists that carry the same spirit. Max records noise under his own name, as well as TANTRIC DEATH, and a number of other collaborative projects. He'll be on tour in Finland this November, playing Helsinki November 6th, Tampere November 8th, and Turku November 9th. This is part one of the interview with Max. To watch or listen to the full episode, go to patreon.com/whitecentipedenoise. For premium Patreon subscribers, there's also a zip file of audio-visual ephemera that Max put together for you to download. All right, hello Max. Welcome to White Centipede Noise Podcast.
Hey, great to be here.
Why don't I let you introduce yourself instead of me introducing you? I've already done the most obvious, but give us a brief introduction to who you are and what you do.
My name's Max Julian Eastman. For the past few years, I've been running Tribe Tapes, a record label no longer focused on just cassettes, but with one foot set firmly in the past, so to speak. Lots of 80s, 90s era cassette reissues onto CD, along with a sampling of what I feel's the best of today's noise. I also record under a plethora of pseudonyms, most notably under my own name. I also record as Tantric Death and have numerous collaboration projects with other people in the scene.
Nice. Well spoken. So when I first came into contact with you was, just a couple years ago when I was really heavy with the distro. And I don't remember if I reached out to you or you reached out to me, but at some point I noticed some pretty interesting stuff coming out of your label, Tribe Tapes. And, after I picked up the first batch of whatever it was, then kind of consistently was looking for stuff you were putting out because I realized you were putting out some really great stuff. And you also sent me a triple tape release of your own solo work. That was really good. I really liked that. I was impressed by that. Kind of out of nowhere. I didn't, I wasn't familiar with Tantric Death. I think I'd seen that name around before, but yeah, I mean, so I liked that. And then and since then I've, Tribe Tapes has really kind of taken over and done a lot of really cool things with, like you mentioned, the reissues of rather obscure 80s and 90s noise and industrial. So tell me about the kind of the evolution of the label itself, because I was looking back through your discography earlier today before we started, and there was, in the early days, kind of a different focus, it seemed, on different types of noise or maybe just a wider range, and at some point it kind of like fell into its own, I feel. Is that accurate? And tell me about how it kind of went along from the beginning to where it's at now.
I'd say that's a fair statement. I kind of look at Tribe as having two different eras, so to speak. Maybe pre-2021, 2022, I didn't really have a focus in mind on the label. When I started in 2019, it was initially just a vessel to release my own tapes. I was performing under the name Great Humor at the time. But I always had an interest in cassette culture. Soon after that, I put together the first comp, Tribe Tapes Volume 1, and began commissioning releases from a few different select artists. And in early 2020, I started a network of a lot more people. Pretty much anyone who wanted to do a release of me at that point, if I felt it was decent enough, I'd put it out. But in the past few years especially, and as I started to focus more on CDs, when you're doing tapes back then in 2019, 2020, it was only editions of 20, 25 copies. I think the most I did at that time was 50, which is for that very first compilation. And those took ages to move at that point. But when I moved into doing CD releases more, when you're dealing with editions of 200 or 300, you have to be more purposeful with what you're choosing. And that's more so where the focus on cassette culture and a handful of contemporary harsh noise artists has come from.
What was it that, you know, really triggered your interest in this cassette culture um era, 80s, 90s stuff? Was that something you got into right away when you were kind of like discovering noise, or was that something that came a little bit later?
And say, when I really got into the cassette culture, 80s, 90s angle of it all, was when I was in college. I had a lot of time in between my studies, so I would do a lot of reading online, and that would take me to a lot of these old blogspot pages like Tape Attack, Die or DIY, No Longer Forgotten Music, and they would just have thousands upon thousands of these old school tape rips. And a lot of these are artists that I'd never heard of before, weren't really discussed in the canon of harsh noise at all. But I guess to answer your question more specifically, there was definitely a period of separation. You know, I was getting into harsh noise when I was in high school. I knew about Merzbow, Wolf Eyes, that really surface level stuff. But I feel like it was when I started discovering that 80s and 90s era that I started forging a more personal connection to it. You know, at that point when I was just listening to Merzbow or Wolf Eyes on my iPod or whatever, it seemed very much like a separate league from what I was in. It felt like something I couldn't really be part of myself, even though those guys got started in the tape trading mail art network themselves. When I discovered the cassette culture movement, that kind of invigorated this feeling I had that I could become part of something.
At what point did you start getting in touch with people? Because that's an interesting, you're working with a lot of artists that are quite a bit older, I would assume. I don't know how old you are exactly, but I would assume you're not of that generation. And you were discovering it through, these blogs, these MP3 blogs. So you're, a generation or two younger than these artists, but you felt a certain kinship with them, right?
Yes, yes. I suppose when I first made contact with some of these more historic cassette artists around 2019, around the time I was first starting the label, I got in touch with Hal McGee. I was just doing some research on him. Very prolific noise artist, Dog is Master, Cause and Effect tapes, and I found out that the zine that he was running in the late 80s and early 90s, Electronic Cottage, was alive in the present day as a webpage and a Facebook group. So I ended up sending Hal an email asking if I could join the little community that he was cultivating. With open arms, he let me in. There's a lot of old school cassette culture greats in there. Hal, of course, Chris Finney, Mental Anguish, Leslie Singer, Al Margolis, Jen Ken. And from pretty much the second I was put in the group, Hal gave me an introduction. So a lot of these people were knocking at my door saying, "Hey, I'm so and so. Nice to meet you." And that kind of opened the door for me to introduce myself and say what I do of the label and propose the opportunity. Hey, would you like to submit a compilation track or something?
Yeah. Were you like the young guy in the group?
There were a couple other younger guys, but the majority, yes. I'd probably say there's like 3 or 4 other people in my age range.
Did you know their history and legacy? Did you feel like there was some sort of I don't know, something to revere there, or something to kind of research beforehand, or was it kind of just like going into it like with peers, or you know what I mean?
There are a few names I wasn't familiar with before in the group, but majority of them I'd been familiar with their cassettes beforehand, so it was kind of a fanboy moment for me not to overwhelm them and be like, "Oh my god, I love this tape you recorded in 1983. Can you tell me how you got this sound or that sound?" So I was very excited, but understandably, I reeled my enthusiasm in a little bit.
I mean, that was the great thing about that era, I think, of the internet. It's almost gone again, like we're still very online, but that time in the internet where you could really just find stuff and it was really kind of Wild West, it's kind of over. I mean, I don't know if Soulseek is still popping like it used to be, but blogs are kind of a thing of the past. Um, at what point did you kind of go from downloading it and just kind of like discovering online? Did you start at some point really collecting the physical items?
Say it was a few years before I started Tribe, shortly after I got into that deep end of Blogspot and crate digging, that I started collecting tapes on my own. There were a few cassettes, that I found on these blogs that I really, really wanted. Had no idea how rare any of this stuff was at the time. So if something came up on Discogs for a somewhat reasonable price, I'd usually snap it up. And this is probably about 7 or 8 years ago when I started collecting really avidly. It was a lot easier to get stuff back then. I feel like since COVID, the secondhand market has skyrocketed a lot. Tapes that you used to be able to get for $15, $20 about a decade ago sometimes go for over 100 now. There's plenty of cassettes in my collection that have skyrocketed to almost $200, $300, which is insane to me. But for a lot of other people, I know that's a pretty average spending weekend.
I mean, do you feel like you brought some of these artists out of kind of obscurity or retirement with, going, we're kind of jumping forward a little bit, but we're going to stay where we're at. But like, you've done a lot of reissues of stuff on Tribe that, I've never heard of. I'm not the biggest historic head of old stuff, but I've seen a lot of names on your label that I'm like, what is this? And then I, read the description. It's like, oh, like obscure tape from, Michigan from 1988. And I'm just like, I've never heard of this. And do you feel like that involvement, whether it's just your involvement with them or just the time maybe that has passed, not you alone, but just everything that's gone on, do you think some of those artists have kind of come out of obscurity in the last few years and gained a wider appreciation or following?
For sure. I think the past 10, 15 years or so, I think what really struck a nerve of a lot of cassette culture artists and made them want to get their stuff back out there are the reissues that started coming out from labels like Vinyl on Demand, where people were getting these really fancy box set treatments. I feel like for a lot of the cassette culture heads, it kind of felt like, well, when's it going to be my day in the sun? So when they're finally getting emails from someone like me 30, 40 years after they've recorded these tapes and no one's really talking to them about them anymore, they're usually very excited to get this material out into the open again. And I do think in a lot of cases, the reissues do help a reevaluation of these artists. Randy Grief is another person who's very acclaimed among cassette culture aficionados. He's considered to be one of the best composers of that era. But among contemporary noise heads, he's not really as well known. So it's been very, very nice for me to see the attention he's gotten since I think we're up to 3 reissues now. I even went on special interest the other day, and I saw a dedicated thread for Randy Grief, which put a smile on my face to see him being discussed in such a predominantly noise-focused place. And I'll make the distinction that even though Randy Grief, for instance, and a lot of these 80s artists are very musical, I still regard them to be noise artists. Instead of making noise with super distorted processed sounds, they're more so making noise with layering sounds, real world sounds, and using those to make a cacophony.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think about that a lot too. Like, I kind of try to like analyze or break down what is noise, what is harsh noise exactly, kind of define it in some way in my mind. And, I do define it as something that's like a cacophony. And I've kind of thought sometimes it's just distortion. It's pure like white noise in different, filterings. But actually, no, it's not. It's like you create noise by taking, a piece of a song, a pop song, and layering it over itself 100 times. Just the layering and the repetition in a kind of non patterned way also makes noise with zero type of distortion or white noise injection. And I think that, yeah, you're right, that is a lot of something predominantly used in a lot of that older stuff. It wasn't relying on the blown out sound all the time.
Yeah, definitely.
Skeleton Dust is proud to reissue two noise masterpieces from Japanese legend Kazumoto Endo, While You Were Out, originally released in 1999, and Brick and Mortar, originally released in 2003. Out of print for years and difficult to find on the secondhand market, Skeleton Dust is excited to make these pinnacle noise albums available again to the public. Both CDs are released in a 6-panel digipack layout, plus featuring some never-before-seen photos. Available now at SkeletonDustRecords.com and at the finest noise distributors worldwide. What is it about old noise that you love so much? Because you're not the only one who kind of puts... I mean, people tend to put, noise from the 90s or the 80s or whatever kind of on a pedestal. And, I sometimes have mixed feelings about that when people are like, oh, everything new sucks. It's only about, like the old stuff is the only thing that really captured that spirit of noise or whatever. And everything is dead now. But, there is something to be said, obviously, for there's something different about it. What is it about older noise, different eras, bygone eras of yore that you really appreciate or that you find special?
There's a lot of things. I guess one of them, the first that pops into my head is the simplicity of it, the limitations that people had in the 80s and 90s, recording onto 4 tracks, unless they are willing to take the time to bounce some of those tracks down and expand on them further. It kind of kept artists in a box, so to speak, but that box also inspired them to be as creative as they possibly could be within those limitations. It's kind of a different perspective now when people just record line in into Audacity, where the sky's pretty much the limit. And with enough creativity in the cassette days, obviously, you could still do anything you wanted, but I feel like that very basic setup of having 4 tracks in front of you, record 1 or 2 at a time, and then arm the next ones. It's a very methodical style, but I think inspired a lot of people to push the limits of that format. And expanding on that too, another thing that really endears me to that era is the unpretentiousness of it. People weren't creating these tapes to become well known. They weren't doing it for clout. Many times people created tapes because they wanted to trade tapes of other people. They didn't have any tapes to trade. The very first Sound of Pig compilation, for instance, Slave Ant Raid, came from that purpose exactly. Al Margolis was buying a fuck ton of tapes in the early 80s and decided, hey, it would be a little bit better on my wallet if I had something to trade with people. So he recorded his first works as if Bwana, got a whole bunch of people, half Japanese, Leslie Singer, to contribute to that first compilation. Anyways, it's just the mail art, the communication parts of it that endear me so much to it as well, which is something I feel is very lacking in today's day and age. I feel like some artists, not really anyone in particular, but really just want to get their material out there so other people will hear it and think of them as an artist. People are always trying to make definitive statements, trying to push the boundaries of noise. You should just create tapes that you find interesting and entertaining and trade them with people that would care about them.
I think that's a good point also, is that there's sort of a frustration nowadays, I think I hear when I talk to noise artists, often newer noise artists, but even some people that have been doing it for a while, they're like, frustrated that their stuff hasn't sold out or that it's, not being hyped up. And, kind of this, why does it work for them and not for me? And I think that's important to remember that, it wasn't always like that probably. I imagine back then it wasn't about like, oh, who can, have the hottest, most discussed tape that can sell out the quickest. It was more just like the networking, the sharing, the trading, of ideas.
I think the instant gratification principle of the internet has spoiled us a little bit, where we're so accustomed to getting instant feedback on things we put out in social media. For instance, you make a post, you'll start getting likes within a minute. So a lot of people tend to apply that same attitude towards their their musical releases, where they wonder, why am I not getting that instant feedback that I want? But instead of trying to get credibility or recognition from mass hordes of people, you really need to establish relationships of just a few people you connect with on a creative level and trade with them. Those are the people who want to hear your work. Don't waste your time sending promos out to people that you think are a big deal just because you want them to hear your work. Stick with the people who care about what you do.
Do you feel like a lot of these people that you've come in contact with, these really more obscure artists from the 80s and 90s tape culture, did they realize that they were doing something at the time that would be appreciated, remembered, listened to, cared about 20, 30, 40, 50 years later?
Not at all. Usually the first reply I get back from them is, I'm surprised anybody's still listening to that.
And, I think conversely, it's to the last point you made, it's also good to remember when people do make something that they think is, you know, something they're proud of or something they like, something they think is good. To also think longer term than just this moment. Why aren't I getting, you know, recognition or sales right now? Because I think a lot of this stuff, and I think also that is the shame that some stuff gets, nowadays even released in editions of 50 or small editions and maybe sells out quickly or doesn't. People are like, oh, why have my 50s copies sold? Because, like we see constantly that 30, 40, 50 years later, I mean, we're not at 50 years yet, but I mean, like, we're crazy about stuff that came out 20, 30, 40 years ago that at the time, no one didn't think it would need that kind of long-term life. And think about when you release something now. If you release a new tape that you think is good, just don't be frustrated if it doesn't sell out now, because someone, in 50 years, 300 copies is nothing,
Yeah, that's incredibly true. Things that feel like they don't really make an impact now could very well be reevaluated the same way we're looking at these older releases 20 years, 30 years from now. So even if your self-defined magnum opus doesn't sell out instantly right away, give it 20 or 30 years. I'm sure somebody's going to be digging it up.
To be fair, we are a totally different, technological time, and with that comes, I mean, objectively, there's a huge oversaturation of noise being produced. I mean, I don't think people should also have the delusion that everything they make is, important. I think people should also at the same time, kind of reel it in some ways. Many people should just, try to self-edit and ask themselves, do I really need to be, why am I putting this out? Is this good? Is this for me, or is this, do people need this? And, so back in those days, of course, there was a much, I think, tighter net of a network,
There
right? I mean, there wasn't this
was,
big
but
social media, like,
there's a lot of oversaturation in those days also. If you flip through old issues of Sound Choice or Op Magazine, there are a ton of tapes listed in the catalog sections of these that have never been put on Discogs, have never been mentioned, entire artists who do not have any online presence. If things seem oversaturated now due to the ease of access, you don't even need physical media, you can just drop whatever crap on Bandcamp. It was very oversaturated back then too, and there are also a lot of hurdles where a lot of people's tapes are recorded really awfully too. It's very common to get a tape from the 80s or 90s where it's only in one channel and barely going up above a few decibels. And on the oversaturation angle too, a lot of artists had trouble getting individual works of theirs recognized because of the sole amount of output they were making too. One of my all-time favorite artists and close collaborators is Zan Hoffman, who had a number of labels for the 80s up to today: Zid Sick, Zid Slick, a bunch of variations on that name. Now it's all been encompassed under one name, ZH27, and in a 27-year span, he put out
Mhm.
close to 2,000 cassette tapes. 2,000. And a lot of them are great, but it definitely brings the perspective where a lot of old tape heads think, Zan could be even more well known than he is now if he honed some of those in, put out just a few releases, put the best sounds and put them on just a few tapes. I disagree. I think the work he did was really needed just for the sole purpose of saying someone did 2,000 fucking cassette tapes. I don't know who else could say that about themselves. But the oversaturation angle, it was real back then. I think the difference is today is just people's entitlement to be heard. People just get upset if they don't get heard enough.
Don't take my nose up.
He's knifing. He's like, he's knifing.
捕まらへんかったらいいんちゃうかな。
For some reason, I just landed this rifle. I don't really know what to do now. You want this?
What the fuck is going on and where the fuck is it happening?
I see people kind of digging out these obscure tapes in various genres. I mean, I witness it, or films. It happens in films too. Oh, this, like uncovered this obscure horror movie from 1981 or something like that. How much stuff do you come across from those times that just isn't good? That you're like, this doesn't need to be reissued because it's just not good.
Good amount of the time, yeah. Like, there's a lot of 80s and 90s tapes that just don't really do it for me. I have older artists reach out to me too, the same way that, contemporary artists will reach out with submissions. Occasionally I have cassette culture artists reach out with a rip of their 80s tape and submit it to Tribe to, attempt to get it reissued. And I wish I could because, I do feel like a lot of stuff deserves more ears, but, not everything from the 80s or 90s is to my liking. And there definitely is, some kind of loose theme that kind of ties together what I do with Tribe. I kind of look at it as all existing in the same universe, which, I mean, literally it does, but also, like, thematically, too.
What's one of your fondest experiences working on a reissue? Because I imagine, especially dealing with older heads, not everyone's just on Instagram DMing back and forth. I mean, I imagine you probably got to get on the phone with people sometimes. Do you ever meet up with them in person, or letters, or have more kind of personal interactions and personal bonds that you form with people over this stuff?
For sure. One of my closest relationships is with Jen Ken Montgomery, who's a very established male artist. He was a protege of Conrad Schnitzler. I got in contact with him initially through Hal McGee's Electronic Cottage group, and pretty quickly we started swapping emails and physical mail art back and forth. And it's kind of blossomed into a real life connection over the past few years, where recently he moved down from New York City, where he lived for 30 plus years, to Richmond, Virginia. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, so that's only 2.5 hours away. So Jen Ken's made a number of stops by the apartment to drop off archival materials. He dropped off the tapes that the Mark Moreland tape reissue was derived from. He's also passed on a ton of archival tapes we're looking to do more with. In the early 90s, he ran a space called Generator, which put on live performances by So many great artists. The Haters, Big City Orchestra, Arcane Device, Chop Shop. And he has all these live masters on cassette, most of which have never been released in any capacity. I know the Haters live performances have been released on CDR at some point, but most of these have never been heard before. Addition to that, there's a box of audio letters from Konrad Schnitzler, close to 100 that him and Ken swapped for over the period of a decade. So it's these very real artistic objects that I have in my possession, and very, very real conversations Ken and I have had discussing these on the phone and in person. So there's definitely, it's rare. It's not everybody I work with on reissues that I'm able to form a close personal connection with like that. But those connections are the ones that really make it the most worthwhile for me.
Have you ever thought about expanding Tribe or maybe by another capacity, like something that would be a more all-encompassing like archival project of this stuff? Because, Tribe, I think you have, we're going to talk more specifically about the label, but, you have a very nice aesthetic. Things are pretty handmade. You do CDs. I mean, that's an archive in itself, but I imagine each release takes kind of quite a bit of a work, and it gets, shown as an individual album, which is great. But with these kind of, some of these guys must just have mass archives of fascinating stuff that is existing just on cassette tape that eventually will be like, hard to access or gone. I mean, I would think it'd be also worthwhile to do something that's like also very kind of volume based, like archiving a lot of the stuff, like the live recordings you just mentioned, instead of, maybe just each one as a CD or each one as a tape, but like make sure they get all in a big box set or online archive somewhere, so they can exist and be safe. And that's a huge undertaking for everyone. And I think there's probably hundreds and thousands of people who have such individual artistic archives that deserve equal treatment,
I totally agree. All the Generator live tapes, all the Konrad Schnitzler audio letters, these are in the process of being digitized right now. Me and Ken are actively discussing plans to archive these. More likely than not, to prevent the Tribe Tapes store from being overrun with 100, 200 different archival releases. It likely will be some different format or series to encompass all these under. And I'm debating the kind of format that would be best to do this on. For instance, a lot of the early Hands 2 material was compiled a while ago on a DVD-ROM. I think it's like around 67 albums that are all put on a single DVD. So maybe doing a couple of DVD-ROMs could be an attractive option to get these out there. Also doing made-to-order cassettes where if there's any specific title that people want, that saves me the burden of having to produce, like 50 copies of every single tape is making them made-to-order. It's food for thought, and things will work out.
I asked some people on Patreon if they had questions for you, and I have a few questions that I'm going to pepper in throughout. Nick Gibas from Bent Window, he asked, is there anything you've tried to reissue or re-release that was impossible to do because of the rights issues or anything like that?
There are very many releases that realm. I'm trying to think of a few off the top of my head. Let me look at my cassette rack back here and see if anything pops to mind immediately. ZBUA is a really great Japanese harsh noise project. Really kind of like in the same realm as like Rudolf Eber with like how fucking cut up and processed it is. Can't find this guy anywhere. Worked a little bit with Franz de Voord in the 90s. He doesn't know whatever happened to him. That's just one of probably... I have a really big list on my phone of all those white whale artists that I wish I could get on the label.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, I mean, these people probably even nowadays, I can't think of how many, contemporary harsh noise guys that I was friends with, in contact with or whatever for a couple years, and they did a couple of really great things, and then they just disappeared, and no one's heard from them or can get in touch with them for for the life of them. So I'm sure the further you go back into that generation and that time, it must be just insane. I mean, I imagine compilations are hard. I've heard about that from another number of people that want to reissue compilations, even on bigger, kind of more well-known, classic labels, well-known compilations that maybe have one or two artists that you just can't get a hold of, and then it's like, well, you can't really do can you do the compilation at that point if not everyone has signed off on it, or if 20 people say yes and number 21 says no, what do you do? It's like, that's got to be really frustrating.
Yeah, it's definitely a gray area in cases like those. With everything on Tribe, I always seek to get 100% of the rights, so if there's ever just the slightest sliver of doubt if I'll ever be able to get something, I think the only 90s compilation I reissued was very infamous comp that PBK put together, Anti-White Bastards. This is in the early 90s when there was a bit of a moral panic about Mark Solitroff and the AWB Recordings label. A lot of people felt AWB was like legitimately very racist, very horrible, so Anti-White Bastards came out as kind of a middle finger to that label. And it's a great compilation on its own merits. But that's one of those very interesting cases where PBK actually was able to get approval from the 12 or so participants to reissue that one legitimately.
I recently did a follow-up interview with Eddie Giles, just a couple days ago, and he talked about the Helltown Incorporated release, which I remember seeing coming out, and I think it was in between me shutting down the distro or something like that, and I didn't grab it. But tell me about that release.
That was a really fun one to work on. Me and Eddie had a lot of phone calls reading up to that, fleshing out the 100-page text that we have accompanying it. It's a really historical document, both covering Eddie's early life, childhood, teenage years, as well as leading into the events that led to recording of Helltown Inc. That's just a really great project. It was done in collaboration with a few other people too. Brian SET is another one. I was actually just listening to that tape last night because someone had ordered a Purveyor's reissue of it. And it really holds up, I think, in the canon of contemporary harsh noise. For a late 80s release, it's really brooding, dark, difficult listening, a lot of really blown out loops and just really strange portions of audio. And yeah, the reissue was accompanied, speaking of Gen Ken and Generator, Gen Ken had some vintage photos from when Eddie, under the alias EJ Vodka, was performing some demonstrations at Generator, where he instructed the audience on how to make tape loops, how to use turntables to make noise. It's equal parts noise performance and lecture. And those are some of the Generator tapes I'm most excited to get out there, too. We were originally talking about getting them out at the same time as the Helltown reissue, but understandably, that's been postponed a little bit as we figure out what to do with the full archive.
Yeah. So, we've talked a lot about the reissue side of Tribe and the kind of the old school focus of the label, but you do release quite a bit of new stuff as well, and a lot of really great new stuff. Tell me about some of the artists, the contemporary artists that you're working with, and what you look for in the artists that you release on Tribe nowadays.
Yeah, so I guess the biggest thing that makes me interested in putting out a contemporary artist on Tribe is the way they handle their work, how do I describe it? I guess their creative attitude towards it. I tend to like working with people who have a similar mindset that I do, where the cassette is the ultimate medium for noise making. Most of the artists I work with on Tribe use tapes as an integral part of their setups. Dead Door Unit, Confounder, Mallard Theory, all these guys use plenty of tapes in their setups. And I think that's the biggest thing that draws me to contemporary artists, is getting that really gritty, fucked up sound. And a lot of the artists I work with on the label, they are coming from kind of a regional area, primarily around New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I forged some pretty strong relationships with, like I said, with a lot of people in Philadelphia, like Dead Door Unit, On Founder, Fricker, New Grasping Machina. These are a lot of the people that I work with closely on a collaborative basis, but it's also not just limited to any geographic location, obviously. I work with a lot of contemporary Finnish artists on the label as well. Lusters, Atrophis, to name a couple, along with a lot of just, I guess, artists in America that haven't really gotten the attention they deserve yet. Like Ineffable Slime is another guy I really enjoy working with on Tribe. When I first put out A Roll of the Dice, he only had a few self-releases and a tape on Fusty at that point. And I was an artist where I really saw potential in him and really wanted to try to bring him to my audience as well. And, there's a few other artists in that tier 2 on the label who I see as just really deserving of that attention.
Do you typically seek artists out, or do they seek you out?
I typically seek artists out. I'll listen to almost all submissions that I receive, if I know who it's coming from, not really so much strangers, because the amount of emails I get is a little overwhelming sometimes. But, if I know somebody's work, I'll listen to what they submit. But typically I plan everything out far in advance, so the vast majority of releases are commissioned.
We've talked now about your label extensively, and I'm sure that'll keep kind of weaving itself in, but you do a lot of noise on your own and in groups. So tell me about your solo noise as Max J. Eastman. The stuff I've heard is, very loop oriented, uses a lot of music, samples looped, sounds like vinyl abuse or tape abuse. I'm not quite sure, but tell me about, your different projects, kind of your main projects, and how you would define them and what you're seeking to do with them.
Yeah, so the easiest stick that I could kind of draw between my projects, I guess primarily between Tantric Death and between the stuff under my own name. Tantric Death utilizes pedals, particularly distortion pedals. Stuff I do under my own name doesn't really. I use flangers sometimes. Henry sent me a Psycho Flange pedal few years ago. That's all over Extreme Psychedelia and the Model of Malehood CD, but since then I don't really use very many effects pedals in what I do. It's kind of just raw tape and vinyl, environmental sounds, field recordings. So Tantric Death is like, I guess like in punk they have chain punk and egg punk. If the stuff that I do under my own name would be egg noise, I hope to God no one ever calls it egg noise. But, Tantric Death would be chain noise, where it's,
Egg?
Yeah, have you heard those terms before? Egg punk and chain punk?
I don't think I've heard those terms.
It might be a little
No, I don't think I've heard those
now,
before.
but like egg punk is like punk that's like more inspired by like Devo or The Residents, like really quirky shit. While like chain punk is like, fucking D-beat or like some crust punk like Amoebix or some shit.
Okay.
Yeah, so you could kind of like draw a similar comparison where it's stuff under my own name is like very abstract and weird, while Tantric Death is like, yeah, fucking harsh.
I kind of knew what you meant, even though I've never heard those terms before. But that's a good way to split it off. I think that's a pretty accurate differentiation with a lot of noise and kind of like abstract music or experimental music, egg and chain. So I have a question actually from Kenny KPG. What is his general view on noise in the live arena? After playing enough shows together, I've noticed that there is very little difference between an MJE set and a Tantric Death set. Those sets are usually ending in erratic manners too, whether it's table flips, chain smoking cigarettes, lighting sparklers inside. So I wonder how much live sets really matter to him in the grand scheme of the environment he's creating. Also, Max, why does my mom keep taking away my Tantric Death records?
You're playing them too late and you're playing them too loud. Anyways, Ken, to answer your initial question, it's all based on the environment and what I'm feeling. I never rehearse for my sets. I don't really care to rehearse. I know I'll go on and I'll have a fun time and do whatever the fuck I want. It really does depend on the venue, you know. Like, let's say if I'm playing at a place like Rhizome in DC, where it's like a living room. I'm not going to be smoking cigarettes and setting off fireworks in a place like that, for instance, because I have respect for venues. But at a place like Field Trip, where I love those guys and those guys love me, yeah, I'll like chainsaw a table in half, or I'll like set off some sparklers, or just do some crazy shit because, you know, people come out to see a noise show. They want to see something a little bit different. And that's kind of where there is a big differentiation on record between what I do under my own name and as Tantric Death. But live, I pretty much do whatever I want. You know, if you book Tantric Death, you might get some weird ambient psych. If you book MJE, you might get me rolling around on the floor. It all depends on what your venue is and what kind of mood I'm in on any given day.
Pete Jennings wanted me to ask you about the Tantric Death Pain Appendix studio sessions at Tribe headquarters.
Pete came by on a business trip. He was headed out to the shore of North Carolina. My apartment in Raleigh was on the way, so he swung by. We got some barbecue at a really good local joint. And then we sat down in my home studio, i.e. Tribe HQ, and busted out, I think, close to an hour, just really ripping harsh noise and tape abuse. We were talking about shopping that around to a few different labels. It's pretty much all finished at this point.
Cool, that sounds like a, promising duo. Hope we hear that soon.
Yeah, it's got some really cool track titles on it, like Hell's Bells and Pungent Pussy Wild.
Do you play live often? Is that something that you put emphasis on, kind of equal emphasis on with studio recording?
Not particularly. Like, if there's an opportunity I want to play live, like in Greensboro, NC, there's a space I really like playing at Field Trip, because I know all the guys who've run that for like many years, but I don't really have much interest in playing local shows the majority of the time. I am very interested, however, getting overseas and touring a little bit more. This November is going to mark my first overseas tour as I embark to Finland for 3 days in Helsinki, Tampere, and Turku, which is extremely exciting. It's going to be Helsinki November 6th, Tampere the 8th, and Turku the 9th. You'd also follow me on Instagram to keep in touch with everything that goes down. Should be a great time.
Yeah. What's your connection? This is the end of part 1 with Max Eastman of Tribe Tapes. To watch or listen to the full 1 hour, 20-minute episode, go to patreon.com/White Centipede Noise. We go on to discuss his connection to Finland, domestic noise, audio letters, John Olson, releasing VHS, the label Oxidation, Purveyor's arm of distribution, releasing a tape package in a McDonald's cheeseburger, his top 5 dub records, and much more. You can also download a zip file of audio-visual ephemera that Max put together if you're a premium tier subscriber. Subscribe at patreon.com/White Centipede Noise to get access to all this and much more.